What is up, everybody? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Afro Latinos. This is your co-host, Aubyn, although tonight I am hosting all alone. Channy's in Puerto Rico, as most of you who are our typical fans would know. And so I decided to bring my two friends, Lowery and Travis, back on the show. You've seen them before if you were an avid fan. Tonight we're talking about the Mount Rushmore of Wrestling. We ended up talking for a very, very long time the last time we were here about wrestling, and it sparked this conversation, and we were all so excited to be here. So thank you, Lowery and Travis, for pulling up to the show. You guys want to do a quick introduction of yourselves and your love of wrestling before we get started?
Yeah, go ahead, Lowery. You have a better resume than I do. I'll open the floor to you.
Just in case anyone hasn't seen you before.
Sure. So I am a professor over at Millersville University. I have been researching professional wrestling for several years now, done a lot of presentations about it, national, international conferences. I'm on the board of the Professional Wrestling Studies Association, and I am feverishly working on a book about the intersections between professional wrestling and representations of otherness, race, gender, etc. That hopefully will be coming out very soon.
And I might add, I am extremely excited. There's not much that excites me to read, but I must admit that is probably top of my list of things I am excited to dive into, because it tackles two of my favorite topics: diversity and wrestling. And you can't ask for much more from me.
I am excited to be done with it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Travis?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I don't have the resume that Lowery does, but I'm a lifelong wrestling fan. I've attended many live wrestling events, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s. I guess my claim to fame in the wrestling world, I had a cup of coffee with Off of the Wild Samoan and WXW as a ring announcer for 3 shows. And that when he was based in Allentown, that was it. Early 2000s, I think like 2004, 2005, and around that time frame. But just a lifelong wrestling fan. Grew up on it, continued to love it, passion. I just love, the sport of it, the theater of it, the entertainment aspect of it. So, yeah, so that's my background.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, again for being on the show. We will get started with all the fun in just a second. So for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Like, I got this and like
And here we go. Let's dive in to the Mount Rushmore of Wrestling. So if you are confused about what this topic may entail, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we will be discussing who we believe are our top 4 wrestlers in the history of wrestling. Now, I will leave this completely up to you, whether your Mount Rushmore is completely personal bias, whether you think they're just hardworking, or whether you think it's the business of wrestling. However you define your Mount Rushmore is completely up to you. So without further ado, let's jump in and talk Mount Rushmore. Who is number 1 on your list? Maybe these aren't ranked in order, but who's the first person that you were going to bring into the Mount Rushmore of Wrestling? Lowery, Travis, whoever would like to begin.
Travis, I yield to you. You yielded to me in the open. I yield to you now.
Sounds good. I don't think, and we had Aubyn and I had a conversation, I could go on for hours about this topic, really. I threw out the possibility of a personal Mount Rushmore versus like a concrete Mount Rushmore. Maybe we can get into that. But if we're going number 1, my Mount Rushmore, I don't think you can do a Mount Rushmore without Hulk Hogan. Not necessarily number one on my list, but if you look at the history of the sport, where it began, and when it started to catch a little more mainstream in the 70s and into the 80s, who carried that banner and that torch all the way through into, the 80s and early 90s, it was Hulk Hogan and the WWF back then. Vince McMahon's right-hand man, ultimate entertainer, broke ground in Hollywood, became a mega superstar across multiple platforms, television, movies. He really, I think, put professional wrestling on the map from, maybe this more local, territorial thing that was, going on in different parts of the country, but wasn't quite mainstream yet. Hulk Hogan was, he had the look, he had the physique, the hair, the microphone skills. Wasn't a great wrestler, but he checked every box. He crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's. Hulk Hogan would be obviously on my Mount Rushmore.
I mean, it's a hard pick to argue with, and like you, I kind of struggled with exactly what this means, right? What the phrase Mount Rushmore of Wrestling actually means, because I overthink everything, and so of course I overthought this. It's practically what my job is. And there would be many different Mount Rushmores for me here, right? I mean, like if we're talking about Mount Rushmore of the best workers in the history of the business, that's much different to me than the history of the best promos in the business or what have you. So the way I decided to think about this was the four people without whom I don't think wrestling would be the same, which didn't necessarily mean actual wrestlers to me so much as people that were in the industry. However, I mean, I have to say, technically all four of the people I ended up choosing, they are all four people who have wrestled, but the first person, and I don't think of them necessarily as, an ordered list of 1, 2, 3, 4, but rather just the first person that I'll talk about is Vincent Kennedy McMahon. To me, when you think about the history of North American wrestling post 1984, it would not exist the way that we know it if it were not for Vince.
And this is Vince Senior, right?
No, this is Vince Jr. Well, okay. I mean, so this is kind of troublesome, right? I mean,
just trying to clarify for the audience.
People call him Vince Jr., but they technically have different middle names, so there is no Vince Jr. or Vince Senior.
Gotcha.
But affectionately, he is known as Vince Jr. Although he has a weird thing about Junior, like he actually made Rey Mysterio drop the Junior from his name because he thinks that it's weird to have Junior. Like it's something that personally bothers him. Weird Vince McMahon facts that don't matter. Anyhow, no, I'm talking about Vincent K Mcmahon,
okay, gotcha.
who took over from his father. He bought the
WWE. Doesn't understand, in case.
Yeah, he bought the WWF from his father, Vince Senior. And then completely wrecked shop with it in ways that his father would never have approved of. But it didn't matter because his father died shortly before he was really able to do all the things he wanted to do. The war to settle the score and the brawl to end it all happens right after Vince Senior kicks the bucket. So, yeah, I mean, for me, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, although a troubled human being in many ways, Vince is not a, and this is, by the way, true, I think, in many ways for a lot of the people that I could put on this list. Not a perfect person, not a guy that I would tell you was a terrific human being per se, but he is, like it or not, the mastermind of what pro wrestling in America has been for the better part of 40 years. And if there were no Vince McMahon, it's hard for me to say confidently that things like WCW or ECW or any of the other wrestling federations that have come to prominence, AEW, etc., TNA, would have existed in the way that they do, not just because in some ways they were parroting something that Vince had crafted, but also because he had built this groundwork for not just what pro wrestling in the modern era was going to look like, and create a kind of blueprint for that. But also he had convinced cable television that and cable television networks that wrestling was a viable option when you're looking for reliable content.
Yeah. I definitely, I mean, we would not have, and I think you're right, we would not have most of what we have right now had he not gone in the directions, for good and bad, all of the good and bad that he contributed. We would certainly not be where we are having most of these conversations, and most of these wrestlers who we probably are going to put on this list would not have existed in their prominence had Vincent McMahon never taken over and done the things they did. And so for sure, if you're going to put anyone on the rest now, in-ring ability, I mean, the man blew out both of his calves walking down to the ring. So he was clearly not a very successful in-ring performer. However, in terms of his presence on screen, as an on-screen personality, as management, as administration, I mean, you can't ask for much more. And to Travis's point for Hulk Hogan, the only reason that I would not touch Hulk Hogan with a 10-foot pole is because of his checkered history, especially when it comes to his rather scandalous behavior. Was the only reason he does not make my list, because Travis, you brought up a million great points about why he deserves to be there. And for all intents and purposes, he does belong there. However, I struggle myself to put him on there. Although with most of these wrestlers, as Lowery mentioned, you will be hard pressed to find someone who has a squeaky clean history throughout the years and could not possibly have done something wrong.
And to Lowery's point, if I was doing a Mount Rushmore of moral wrestlers, I don't think Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea would find his way to that
you
mountain.
might be able to get a Mount Rushmore because there's not that many who would have survived.
Good point.
I was about to say, I don't know if there are 4 that I could put on there in the first place. I mean,
so you might just end up with a Mount Rushmore based on the fact that it's few and far between for that purpose only. Lowery, were you going to say something else? I think.
No. I was actually about to ask if you actually. I mean, I know we both have our picks, but I didn't know if you were going to do picks yourself as well.
I've got my picks.
Okay.
I don't know if my picks are necessarily. I think I come from a lot of different places from this list. There's some personal favorites and how I feel those personal favorites have shaped wrestling and what they did for wrestling, and some that I have just found over time a new respect for in terms of what they were able to do and what they were able to succeed in their time. And so I will throw my first in the ring, and I think I have gained an entirely. And Travis, this is thanks to you. Actually, I don't know that he would have made my list had you not have recommended the documentary to me. But I'm putting Andre the Giant on the list of Mount Rushmore because of his, number one, tremendous work ethic. Because he could have done whatever he wanted to, because no one was going to stop a 7-foot tall, 400-pound man. And you were not going to tell him what to do. But the fact that he got up every day and traveled as much as he did, not only at that time, of course, it was regional promotions across the United States, but he was also traveling the world and performing around the world. And he would just go and put on a show for absolutely anyone. And when it comes to Hulk Hogan, Travis, he didn't have to give up what he did, give up his name, Andre the Giant. I mean, his career was effectively not the same after that match. Now, much of that was health concerns, that he was just not able to do a lot of what he wanted to be able to do. But that giving the flowers per se to Hulk Hogan, allowing him to become the next star. I mean, he didn't have to do that, because if he wanted to have just and if you watch the documentary, there's many a times when a wrestler has just been too high on the horse and they thought they were going to just bully Andre. I don't know how anyone could think that. But and he turned into a stiff wrestler, and you were not going to do anything that he didn't want you to do. And so I gained a new profound respect for Andre the Giant as a worker, not to mention his not just in the wrestling world, but in the entertainment aspect, from his movies and his ethic and what he did there. I think we would be remiss to not include him because of how much he brought. And again, wrestling became part of that draw to wrestling was coming to see this freak of nature who was huge and that brought in crowds and crowds of people just to see him. So again, I don't know that we would have gotten even to Hulk Hogan, in that type of entertainment had Andre not done what he did. Tragic his life was the way that it was, and he died so soon and so early. Would love to have seen what he could have been had that never happened. But that's I'm putting him up on my Mount Rushmore. So
yeah, hard to argue.
No. In fact, I don't know if we're ready for number 2, but I have Andre's number 2 on mine. To every point you just nailed. In addition, you think of how wrestling became as popular as it is today, and and Lowery, you can speak to this. It was, at one point in time, it was a carnival act. It was a regional territory thing where you'd come and see the show, and Andre was a giant, and he transcended that territorial to the national thing. He was, a focal point of a lot of Vince McMahon's matches and storylines, and he was the giant. And it's interesting to hear Lowery talk about McMahon, and you hear all these terrible stories about his relationships and how he treats people and his talent, and uses them to his benefit. But in watching that documentary, Aubyn, it really genuinely seemed like the McMahon family cared for Andre. And I don't know if it's because, Andre was that larger than life character, or he was such a sweetheart, or if he really helped, and maybe Vince McMahon realizes this, he really helped the company get to where it is by putting guys like Hulk Hogan over, by getting up every day in pain, barely able to walk, but still going out there and getting in the ring. And maybe that's something that Vince McMahon saw and appreciated. And a larger than life person, a larger than life personality and character. Andre the Giant, I think, for what he did to help put the business over the edge at such an early time, before there were those, the big muscle bound guys that Vince eventually gravitated towards, and those Hollywood faces that Vince eventually gravitated towards and still does today. Andre was, a number one, and you hear all the stories about him, and nobody really has a bad thing to say about him. So yeah, Andre's definitely on my Mount Rushmore as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to be fair to Vince, I mean, I don't want to make it seem like he's never done anything good in his life.
Right.
I mean, I do believe that Vince cares about a lot of the talent that's there. I just, I think Vince, affection from Vince McMahon looks different than affection from the average person does, right? It is affection that is constantly to be tempered by a kind of economic realism. So, I mean, he may love you, but hey, listen, if you're not getting over, pal, and things aren't going well, then we got to move on, right? But I mean, there are stories of him helping people through drug addiction by putting them in, care centers and that sort of thing, and paying for people's treatment and all those kind of things. I mean, and there are people. I mean, I think Andre's an interesting case, right? I think part of the reason that he loved him was because Andre had a good relationship with his dad. And there were a couple of people that I feel like before his dad sold the company to him, he basically told him, like, one of the conditions of sale is there are certain people you're going to take care of because they did it right. They've always been good to the business. You be good to them. And Andre, I think, was one of those guys. And Andre also did things that I think Vince just generally loves. It seems to me, and granted, I've never spoken to the man, I've never met him, but it just seems to me from everything I've read that one of the most important qualities in a person to Vince is loyalty. That's one of the key things that to him either makes you a great person or a terrible person. And Andre was incredibly loyal. I mean, it didn't matter what you asked Andre to do. He would just say, okay, boss, I'll go out there and I'll do the thing you asked me to do. No problem. You want me to go out there and make the Ultimate Warrior not look like a piece of shit? All right. No problem. I'll do it. It didn't matter what you asked him to do. He just did it. And I would also add, if you've never seen Andre the Giant throw a drop kick, which he couldn't do in the WWF days, but in 1970s Andre could throw a mean drop kick. You've never seen a drop kick until you've seen Andre do a drop kick. It's a whole different kind of deal. All right, so my second pick for this, I am going to go with El Santo. El Santo is maybe the most famous, well-regarded wrestler in the history of Lucha Libre. He is often credited with being the individual who popularized wrestling in Mexico and took it from being something that was just sort of marginally popular to being the almost religious-like institution that it is there today. Not only was he a very good wrestler in the ring, but he was very much the kind of pop culture figure that we think of somebody like Hulk Hogan being in America, right? He starred in a huge number of films. I think over 50 movies that he was in. There were comic books dedicated to the man, television shows that he was in and that were about him. And so he was this larger than life figure within the Mexican wrestling community. And arguably, a lot of the things that we think of when we think of Mexican wrestling, from the value that's placed on the mask in Mexican wrestling to the different styles of maneuvers that are used, simply wouldn't exist if he hadn't been around. There's a great quote from Eddie Guerrero where someone asked him once about El Santo and how big of a deal he was. And he said that for people living in Mexico, El Santo in the the 50s, the 60s, that he was a bigger deal than Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold Steve Austin put together. And you're talking about a guy who wrestled for an incredibly long time. He started wrestling in the 1930s. He didn't stop wrestling until the 1980s. Wow. I mean, that's an insane career. So, I'm trying to kind of give love to different areas of pro wrestling here. And if Vince McMahon is the character without whom, or the person without whom, North American wrestling could not have existed, then El Santo is the person without whom Mexican wrestling can't exist.
And I think that says a lot, because you think about how passionate Mexican wrestling and wrestlers and wrestling fans are. So that's really interesting to hear that he has that sort of legacy within that, within that culture, really.
And yeah. I would add, it's someone actually I've never heard of El Santo, although I probably should have. But it's interesting that you bring him up, because it's the perfect kind of segue into my second pick. Because for me, the embodiment of success from a Latin wrestler, in my eyes, from a work ethic and from that perspective, is none other than the late Eddie Guerrero. And everything that he brought to the wrestling world, again, I mean, he really popularized. I mean, we've had a lot of, and I'm sure this is somewhere in your book, Lowery, a lot of rather interesting depictions of Latin wrestlers from the, what were they, the Luchadors? What were they? Was that the tag team Primo and Epico at one point had been repackaged as Matadors?
They repackaged them a couple of times, but that was many times. They had a Matador gimmick for a while there,
including the little person who dressed as bull.
Yes,
just because why
Toro.
not? Because why not? We've seen. What was the name? Forgive me for forgetting. There was a tag team. I think Juventud was in the group. There was, or maybe Psychosis. There was a group of, it was either two or a faction of wrestlers who were like gardeners or lawn care providers. They wore green jumpsuits. It was the typical Cholo Mexican, the super stereotypical depiction of a Mexican wrestler. I cannot for the life of me remember the name of it.
I feel like Juventud might have been part of that. I do vaguely rings a bell, but it might have been one of those things I also tried to forget.
No.
I think Super Crazy was also in that group.
I think that might be exactly what I'm thinking of. I'm gonna Google it. So keep talking if you don't mind before I let's see.
This is also around the time when they took Chavo Guerrero and made him like a guy who was going. He was like how I want to phrase it exactly. He was basically like a country club member. Like he dropped his whole gimmick and suddenly became like a yuppie country club guy. It was one of the strangest gimmick changes I've ever seen in my life.
Which shared no resemblance
to of the way right. Go ahead, Jarvis.
I was going to say Chavo's gimmick. That gimmick had no resemblance whatsoever to the Pepe gimmick, where he walked out in WCW with the Pepe horse, which was also an interesting one that they give these Latin wrestlers. But yes, okay, Aubyn. So
the Mexicools was the name of the
Mexicools. That's right.
I was 2/3 of the way right. It was Super Crazy, Psychosis, and Juventud. I mean, you can't get much more stereotypical than that depiction. But for someone whose mantra was cheat, lie, and steal, and he would worm his way, you could not help but love the character of Eddie Guerrero, even when he did everything wrong on screen and nothing he did was clean. He was the epitome of a hard worker from everything that I've heard of him. He was universally loved from not only the Hispanic community, but from the non-Hispanic community as well, from the wrestling community. And without Eddie Guerrero, Chavo certainly does not have the success of the lengthy career that he's had. Vicky doesn't get her on-screen time as the general manager of SmackDown, although I certainly wish that time did not exist. She does not become the on-screen personality that she has been. Rey Mysterio certainly would not have. I mean, he owes his entire career, for the most part, and his success, unfortunately, to the passing of Eddie Guerrero. But nonetheless, he owes much of his career, some of his biggest rivalries, and what made him a household name was because of Eddie Guerrero. And so for what he did for the culture, for what he did in terms of just being universally loved as a character from all perspectives, and another wrestler who unfortunately was gone way too soon, and whose life left a deep impact, I believe, in the wrestling community, I have to throw Eddie Guerrero on my Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, and my love for Eddie Guerrero came in the mid-'90s in ECW, and then when that whole wave of wrestlers went to WCW. But I remember Eddie also, where he kind of began, always a great worker, always a great talent, incredible in the ring, but then he kind of came into his own with the Latino World Order and his rivalry with Eric Bischoff, where he would quit or threaten to quit. And then it blurred that line between work and shoot, where you didn't know really now anymore if Eddie was really quitting, right, if Eric Bischoff was really firing him. And I think a lot of that maybe is what Vince and some of the writers at WWE saw, and they thought, hey, this is a guy that we can bring in. Great mic skills, great intensity, and fantastic in the ring, could probably work with almost anybody. And he really just, he found his own, and then overcame an automobile accident, and world champion, and obviously gone too soon. But Eddie Guerrero is a fantastic pick for all the reasons you listed.
Yeah, I mean, while he won't be on, my Mount Rushmore that I'm creating for this purpose, I mean, if I was creating a Mount Rushmore of the best workers in the history of the business, then I think that Eddie's probably on that for me. And if I was doing a Mount Rushmore of purely Latin wrestlers, Eddie's absolutely on there. I mean, there's no question that he has to be on there. El Santo also makes that list, obviously, but Eddie would be there with him. But yeah, I mean, God, when I think about guys whose matches I could just watch over and over again and never get tired of them, I mean, I could watch the hell out of Eddie Guerrero matches all day long.
And not to mention, he has one of the greatest entrances. I mean, there have been a lot of guys who came to the ring in cars. JBL. I mean, they had awful wrestler. What's his name? God, what is his name? Now I'm forgetting everyone that I've ever. He was in WWE. He was like the JBL character, but he was Spanish. He is incredibly reckless in the ring.
Alberto Del Rio.
Alberto Del Rio. That's exactly who I'm thinking of. They've got a lot of guys coming in with cars, but none as cool, and no theme song as recognizable as Viva la Raza, and just the fun with the convertible and everything about his entrance was memorable. He's definitely on my Mount Rushmore of entrances, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, if we're going to talk about great car entrances, let's talk about WrestleMania 6 and Rhythm and Blues coming in the pink Cadillac, which was being driven by DDP.
That's right.
Oh,
yeah. Wow. Good fun fact there.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got two out of the four. We are going to take a quick break for an ad, and we'll be right back. Fun fact: there is no ad being read. I just put that in there because when I put this onto Anchor, when I upload this to Anchor, I listen for this spot for the cut, so I know exactly where to put the ad. So it's become kind of a running joke that every week, every episode, I say, and we'll be right back with the word of my sponsor. And then wait like 2 seconds, and we're back. And I realized I probably should have prefaced that.
I was about to say, man, that's awesome. You got sponsors.
I was waiting for the ad spot to pop up on my screen. It's great.
It's Dollar Shave Club. You want to get your Dollar Shave Club?
Athletic Greens.
That Manscaped, HelloFresh, any one of those podcasts or any one of those programs. Send us your sponsorships. We'll read them. We got you. But we have an Anchor sponsorship that they give to everyone who uses their service. So that goes right in there. And now we'll continue with the episode with the latter half of our Mount Rushmores of Wrestling. Let's switch up the order here and go Lowery to Travis this time instead of Travis to Lowery. So Lowery, give us your next member of the Mount Rushmore of Wrestling.
So I'm gonna go very old school here once again. So we've done North America, we have done Latin America. I also felt like Japan deserved some attention here, and so I'm gonna go with a guy named Ricky Dozen. And Ricky Dozen was sort of the grandfather of professional wrestling in Japan. I actually struggled a lot over this pick because I was thinking it was going to either be him or possibly Antonio Inoki. But Ricky Dozen's actually the guy who trained Antonio Inoki, along with several other major wrestling figures in Japan. And he's also the person who's largely responsible for getting the first television contracts for wrestling in Japan. So, much in the way that El Santo made sure that the mechanisms for the popularity of wrestling in Latin America would exist long after he was gone, Ricky Dozen did the same thing in Japan. Now, Dozen doesn't have nearly as long of a career as Santo. He's actually killed in he is killed by the Yakuza when he's like 39, 40 years old, right in there. Super stupid thing. A guy stepped on his shoe and they got into an argument and he got stabbed because of it. It was the dumbest possible reason to die. Very, very Bruiser Brody kind of thing that happened to him. But I mean, in those 30 plus years that he was alive, he really laid the groundwork for what would be the popularity of professional wrestling in Japan, and that is one of the most important wrestling cultures in the world today. I would argue that honestly, there's a fight between Latin America and Japan for who has the most hardcore fans, and then North America is a distant third in that situation. And so it just felt wrong to me to not tip the hat to Japan with an inclusion here because of how incredibly influential that culture has been to professional wrestling. And a lot of the people that were trained by Ricky Dozen would go on to create federations themselves. Inoki creates New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is obviously such an incredibly huge deal now. And so, in a lot of ways, I mean, if I were to trace the history of pro wrestling back in Japan, I mean, it sort of begins with him. And so I feel like for that reason, he's got to be on the list.
And fun facts, because Lowry, you're bringing up a lot of people that are huge to wrestling history that I am not familiar with, which does not surprise me in the slightest because of your vast knowledge of the sport. Fun fact, he's actually born in Korea. So
yes, that's true. He is Korean, but
he's half Korean
yeah.
and Japanese, but born in Korea and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2017, becoming the first Korean inductee according to his Wikipedia page. So thank you, Wikipedia.
Yeah. It's true. It's kind of strange that he's actually Korean, and he actually, also strangely, he spent much of the first half of his life trying to become a sumo wrestler.
Yes,
and it's only when his sumo career sort of petered out that he was like, well, pro wrestling would be a cool idea too. And then, so the second half of his life is spent making pro wrestling a huge deal in Japan. And I mean, gosh, it's hard not to wonder what could have been had he lived longer.
I think when I heard you go with your list, Lowry, once you chose, I knew you were going different cultures. With the Latin world, I was expecting something from Japan, but I thought for sure you'd go Antonio Inoki. So it's interesting to hear you go Ricky Dozy. You told me you kind of, debated those two. And, just from the few things that I know about Inoki at all, it did seem he was kind of that Hulk Hogan of the Japan wrestling scene. So to know that there is actually somebody even bigger than him, like a Godfather type, that's really interesting. And like to Aubyn's point, you always learn something talking to Lowry here.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, so I struggled with Inoki. Inoki's probably the more familiar figure to American fans, not just because New Japan Pro Wrestling is such a huge deal, but because he was instrumental in bringing in a lot of American wrestlers to Japan for the first time and really cross-pollinating those cultures together in ways that had not been done before. And then, of course, he had the famous match with Ali, which I mean, much bigger to me than having Mr. T at WrestleMania or having Mike Tyson at WrestleMania. The man fought Muhammad Ali, when Muhammad Ali was still Muhammad Ali. And it's one of the biggest, most incredible events ever. Not a great match by any means. I mean, like if you watch it, it's not good. But the simple fact that he convinced Ali to get into a wrestling ring with him, it was a crazy thing at the time. Nevertheless, I mean, I would argue that none of the things that Inoki was able to accomplish in his incredible career would have been possible without Dozen.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good to know. It's good. That's good research material for us in the future. I think they're Aubyn.
Listen, I'm loving. I got my Wikipedia open, ready for the next one.
Well, do you want me to go ahead with number 3 on my list?
Yeah,
all right. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to stick with the moral high ground here for my Mount Rushmore, and I guess this is a very topical selection here over the past 3 weeks or so. But the Nature Boy Ric Flair is on my Mount Rushmore. For many obvious reasons. I mean, when I grew up watching wrestling in the 80s and early 90s, I was strictly WWF fan. I didn't know of anything else that existed, but every now and then you'd flip through the television, you'd see something on TBS Superstation, and you'd see these guys wrestling. What is this? Who are these guys? And you slowly start to learn of this other federation, these other wrestlers and this other company, and Ric Flair was the guy. Ric Flair, he's transcended, for decades now into pop culture, and he's giving rally cries for Florida State football and Notre Dame football, and a really good in-ring performer. He had a long history of being a backstage guy. Some of it maybe not so positive, maybe not so good if you want to have him in your corner. Wielded a lot of weight in the WCW days. But he, certainly well respected inside the ring. If you look at his relationships now currently with guys like, Triple H and Shawn Michaels, kind of that new generation of guys, and the way they, look up to him and hold him in such high regard. He definitely, was a guy that you think of Hulk Hogan as kind of like the movie star, for me at least, the movie star, superstar, big muscle guy. Ric Flair was I'm actually going to get in the ring, I'm going to wrestle you, and I'm going to show you why I'm better than you. Oh, and I also look good, and I'm a limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling, and dealing guy, and I'm fantastic on the microphone. My gosh, listening to some of his promos from the 80s and 90s, it's you just kind of in awe that the man could say those kind of things, even get away with some of those things even back in the day. But Ric Flair is on my Mount Rushmore.
It's a great pick, and it's interesting how this list has gone for each of us, and it shows you a lot of where we kind of come into wrestling from a fan standpoint. But it's also interesting that each of our picks in some way has transitioned into another, because Travis, I would not be able to say my next man on my Mount Rushmore had there not been a Ric Flair, because this man who belongs on my personal Mount Rushmore of wrestling, he's actually the man who ended Ric Flair's in-ring career and who put him in retirement. None other than the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels, when I think about the history of wrestling and I think about the moments, right? So the moments that stand out in wrestling history, from his time when he makes that change with Marty Jannetty and hits him with the sweet chin music through the glass. I mean, that moment right there will forever go down as one of the greatest moments in wrestling history, I think. And it's so iconic, from his time with DX, being the Heartbreak Kid, his retirement, his coming, everything that he's done as a wrestler, being one of the hardest working wrestlers, being a super freak athlete, being able to do everything that he was not supposed to be, he shouldn't be able to do all the things that he does, certainly not to such a high level as what he does, to his feuds and iconic matches with Ric Flair, with all of the people that he feuded with. I mean, you do not have much of the early 2000s wrestling if Shawn Michaels isn't there, and unfortunately he dealt with a lot of back problems and a lot of health concerns there too. But I believe that without Shawn Michaels, we would not, again, be where we are. And from what he's done as a producer, also, he's heading up this next newest 2.0, NXT 2.0, whatever it is, mainly because of Hunter's health. But he's stayed behind the scenes. He's been coaching, and you don't have an Adam Cole without a Shawn Michaels. There's so many wrestlers that you don't get to this day without having had Shawn Michaels be as influential as he was. And so I would be remiss if I did not include Shawn Michaels on my Mount Rushmore of wrestling. I think he belongs there. I think he definitely is influential. I think he changed a lot of what wrestling is in terms of especially the entertainment business.
And I love both of those picks. And, if I was doing if this list was best workers in the industry, then, certainly Flair and Michaels would be on that list. I find it hard not to include both of them. And they both, quite frankly, have some problematic things just even recently in their past. It's not just Rick. Actually, there were some really disturbing accusations that have been made about Shawn in just the last month or two, from way back in his past. Like we said before, if you're looking for like squeaky clean human beings, pro wrestling probably not the place you want to be. Sometimes my wife will be watching wrestling with me, and I'll make some comment to her about, interesting story about this guy. He did this incredibly awful, dehumanizing thing to another human being once. And she'll just look at me and be like, why do you watch this? Like, what redeeming quality is there in this for you? And I'm like, well, it's really great though. If you can get past the fact that, a lot of these people are kind of shitty human beings outside of the ring, there's a lot to be loved here.
Yeah.
Right. So that means me. I forgot for a second that it's my turn. So for my last pick here, I actually felt like I needed to give some love to women's wrestling. And so for that, I'm going to put Mildred Burke on the list. Mildred Burke is the first recognized world heavyweight champion in the history of American women's wrestling. And really, she and her husband / manager at the time, Billy Wolf, really kind of helped set up the blueprint for how you succeeded as a female wrestler in the modern wrestling industry. She toured with him throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and became a household name in women's wrestling. And when it was getting time for her to retire, she set up a women's wrestling academy, much in the same way that Moolah would do later on, and helped train a lot of the young women who would come after her and become big stars. And Mildred, by all accounts, was a very, very talented in-ring performer. Wrestled at a time where oftentimes she actually had to do a lot of intergender wrestling. They would bring men into the ring to wrestle her to prove that, hey, this lady can actually she can do it. She's the real deal. Because there was still the need to uphold kayfabe at the time and to sort of prove the legitimacy of what you were doing. That sort of mentality had not left. And I think that another reason that I like the idea of putting Mildred in here is not just because she was someone who ticked a lot of boxes in terms of historical firsts in women's wrestling, or that she was a great in-ring performer, but also because I think Mildred's story, her personal story, actually mirrors a lot of the struggle and the difficulty of being a woman in professional wrestling. Billy Wolf gets my vote for the single worst human being that has ever been associated with professional wrestling by a country mile, and that is saying a lot.
That's a lot.
But Billy Wolf was an evil, abhorrent human being, and I hope he is burning in hell. He essentially tricked Mildred into marrying him, and then he refused to. He promised her he would marry her, got her to leave her home, go with him when she's about 16 years old, and then told her he wouldn't marry her unless she could prove that she could make money for him, and that if she failed to do this or she tried to run away, that he would report her as part of the Mann Act. Now, the Mann Act at the time said that if you were a woman who was traveling across state lines for immoral purposes, that you could be put in prison. So he basically said, you're either going to do what I want or I will imprison you for the rest of your life. And then he sexually abused her. He slept around on her. He physically abused her. And, oh, yes, the cherry on the top, when they had a child together, he was sleeping with another woman. The child was in its bassinet, either in the same room or in an adjoining room, but the child was making too much noise in the bassinet. So Billy got up, pants down, slapped the kid around, about 1 year old, and went back to doing his business because, hey, I'm trying to do my thing over here, and the kid's being too loud. Mildred eventually leaves him and divorces him and moves on with her life. But yeah, the struggle in terms of the violence and the heartache and the difficulty that went along with being a woman in professional wrestling, and still does today, make no mistake, but was especially prevalent in, say, the 40s and the 50s, being a woman in this business, I think speaks incredibly powerfully to how much courage and tenacity it took to do this as a female in the business. And Mildred did it before other people did. So yeah, she gets a place on the Mount Rushmore for me.
Ooh,
That's heavy. That's some heavy stuff, Lowery.
I was just reading all the Wikipedia. I was like, oh my, this is like, this is unreal.
Wow. And to hear that backstory, so think about that. You're a woman in a man's sport, a man's world, really.
Especially at the time.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then to be dealing with that personal story and really personal tragedy. And that's one of the interesting things. And as I'm listening to you tell me this, Lowery, I'm thinking of a Dark Side of the Ring episode that's yet to be produced.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I'm thinking, documentaries like that open your eyes to, a lot of the things that were going on in the sport behind the scenes. And for somebody like that to kind of make it out and blaze a trail for herself, and then really ultimately women today, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think an argument can be made that you wouldn't have, your Sasha Bankses and your Charlotte Flairs and your Becky Lynches, and even going back before that, your Alundra Blazes and Sherry Martels and people like that, if it weren't for people like Mildred Burke saying, I know this is about to suck beyond belief, but God damn it, I just love wrestling so much I'm willing to put up with it.
That's awesome. All right,
Travis, you're up.
Here's what I'm gonna do, Aubyn. I'm gonna slide in a few names that weren't on my official Mount Rushmore. I'm just gonna fire them off real quick because I want to give them some props. Because really, with my last pick, I wrestled with it, so to speak. I'm confident with it.
I gotta hit a rim shot.
Thank you. And I'm happy with where it ended. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention guys like Macho Man Randy Savage, Chris Jericho, Bret Hart. I love Mr. Perfect, who we talked about on the last show together. Kurt Angle, Mick Foley, Bobby Heenan, Paul Heyman, and Shawn Michaels, who we already spoke of. So those are just some of my personal favorites who I absolutely love. Rowdy Piper, Raven, the list could go on. There's some of those oddball characters in there too. But my last guy, Stone Cold Steve Austin. And because not necessarily, what he ended up becoming, but I look at him compared to the other three on my Mount Rushmore, he's kind of the ultimate underdog story. Athlete when he's a younger age, but just grew up watching wrestling with his father and ended up breaking into professional wrestling. He went through a whole bunch of different gimmick changes, and he had hair. He had hair. My gosh, Stunning Steve. Eventually, the Hollywood Blondes with Brian Pillman, and then basically kicked to the curb in WCW to find his way in ECW. Where he cut some incredible promos, but at the time, mid-90s ECW, it's still kind of a blip on the radar. Makes his way in like 95, 96 to WWE. They give him that terrible ringmaster gimmick, and they give him the $1 million title, which if you look back, I don't know if there was anybody less earning of $1 million title than a guy, shaved head, put together and just in black trunks, like, the ringmaster. It just didn't seem to make sense. You could tell they were trying to strap anything to him to get him to, have a decent push and a decent pop with the crowd and somehow relatable. And it wasn't until that King of the Ring where he cut that scathing promo on Jake the Snake, where he finally became his own guy, Austin 316. And he is that kind of success story that a lot of those guys, where they say Vince wants you to grab the brass ring, he might be one of the first ones to ever truly do it. And I mean, look at his career since then. He carried that company, I feel like, on his back through that whole Attitude Era. And without that Attitude Era, I don't think we have, a lot of the characters that we do today, a lot of the professional wrestlers, even some of the younger ones now that say they looked up to Stone Cold when they were younger. Steve Austin makes my list. And great on the mic, hell of a worker. Talk about some entertaining matches. Some of his big matches, WrestleMania 13 is one of my favorite of all time. Some of his big popular matches for sure rank right up there with some of the other ones.
Yeah. And, I think he also deserves a lot of credit for the fact that he was able to completely change his style of wrestling after the neck injury, right? I mean, Steve Austin in WCW is he's a technical wrestler, right? I mean, like he's able to put on a 5-star classic mat wrestling show with you. And then he gets dropped on his head by Owen, and suddenly it's like, well, my body doesn't work the way it used to. Better become a brawler. And he becomes, maybe the best brawler in the history of the business.
And a legitimate brawler too. Yeah, to that point, that you watch some of those bigger guys that are just brawlers. They're hard to watch sometimes. Steve Austin was a guy that, and I think it's because he had so many of those great matches prior to the injury. You knew he could wrestle, and then to see that translate into more of a brawl, fist for fist, knock you down, drag it out style. And he had so many good matches after that injury. There's so much to be said about him. I think you're exactly right. That's great.
And I think that if you just look at his career from when he makes the change, and Stone Cold Steve Austin is such a popular name, and so if you were only looking at his career as Stone Cold Steve Austin, I think he still has a legitimate shot at being on that list, right? Because he, again, like my feelings about Shawn Michaels, he has some of the most iconic. I mean, the stunner does not work for many other people other than something about the stunner. Middle fingers to the face, throw me a beer. That entire character with such personality could not possibly have done by many other people other than Steve Austin. And so I think that even with that gimmick and who he became, and I mean, he's transcended even wrestling, and he's taken that image, that name, into other venues. And I think that shows so much of his character and how, and when you really have a gimmick that works for you, I mean, you could do anything. I mean, Stone Cold Steve Austin as that gimmick could have probably punched your mom in the face, but you would have thought it was the greatest thing ever because Stone Cold Steve Austin just punched your mom in the face. If he hits your wife with the stunner, it's gonna be like, damn, I mean, what am I supposed to do? I'm not fighting him. Like,
you applaud,
you just got to take the stunner. Like, I don't know what to say. So I mean, for sure, he deserves all of the flowers. He deserves all of the credit for all that he was able to do, especially another one of those wrestlers who transcended injury, who shouldn't have been able to have the career he had because of something so debilitating. Which leads me to my last and final member of my Mount Rushmore. Another iconic personality. Another person who I think was able to use the most of what he was given, especially when he found that gimmick that stuck and succeeded through a gimmick change that I don't know would have worked for many other people. Again, I got to go with Mark Callaway, The Undertaker. Number one, he's one of my all-time favorites. Number two, I mean, The Undertaker, the bell toll, his work with Paul Bearer, his Brothers of Destruction with Kane, the rivalries with The Rock and Stone Cold, and all of these wrestlers that we've mentioned today as some of the greats. We have such iconic moments. The casket match. I mean, those don't work with many other wrestlers outside of The Undertaker. Even his transition to the American Badass, which seems so ridiculous, right? But it worked for Mark Callaway because he's 6'10", he's tatted up all over the place, and he looks like he would kill you in an instant. And he probably could if he wanted to. But from the super creepy Undertaker to the American Badass, I don't think that there's many other that could have made such a successful transition seem so flawless. And then to go back, and that's something that we will have forever. The WrestleMania moments, the streak ending Shawn Michaels' career, all of these great WrestleMania moments. I think we would really be missing something big if we didn't have Undertaker in the conversation, at least. And for being as big as he is, his ability to move in the ring was certainly not hindered in any way. I mean, even in the latter parts of his career, he's still the suicide dive outside of the ring. Someone 6'10", close to 300, you're not supposed to be able to move your body like that. I mean, one of the stupidest setup of a move, but the Snake Eyes it's simply stupid that a wrestler would allow you to walk them all the way. I mean, you're not like, who's doing, like going to the corner, walking on the ropes. Someone his size should not have been standing up there, and certainly no wrestler would ever actually let someone do that to them. But from the chokeslam to the tombstone, the eyes rolling back in the head with the tongue. I mean, even when he had the submission finisher with Brock Lesnar for like those last couple times that they had their little rivalry. But I mean, he has so many historic moments in wrestling that I think and maybe this one is just personal bias, but he's one of my favorites and will forever be on my Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, and if you're breaking it up and you want to go Mount Rushmore of best gimmicks, I think he's right up there. My gosh, I mean, that's and you talked about the American Badass gimmick, which, you know, looking back, I wasn't a fan of it at the time, but almost like you needed a break, and he was a guy that could represent that. He walks into a bar in Texas at 6'10", 300 pounds. He's an American Badass. He's pulling up on his Harley. He's going to kick your ass, and then he's going to leave. You know, so it worked, and then he goes back, and yeah, definitely great gimmick and a good selection for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that he is. I mean, if we're talking about, you know, characters, like the Undertaker is the greatest character in the history of wrestling to me. And that wouldn't be true if anyone other than Mark Callaway had been playing him. Yeah. You know, Mark he understood how to make that gimmick work. You know, I mean, sometimes the perfect person comes along and the perfect gimmick is there for them, and and damn, I mean, it just worked out for him, you know, and
to be fair, he survived some pretty awful ring attire. I mean, those ugly, huge purple gloves and the very tattered black that he wore as the original Undertaker. The transition to the black trench coat might have been the best costume change in terms of ring attire that worked for a character, because but that, you know, he's an icon. I think that a lot of wrestlers today look up to him. And I mean, he's someone that, you know, if Undertaker speaks, you listen. And he was kind of, you know, there was always that discussion in the backstage court, you know, that kind of stuff that would happen. Like, Undertaker is the deciding voice, you know, you're listening to him when he speaks, because otherwise he might actually hurt you. Go ahead, Charles.
No, I was going to say, to your point, you know, survive some questionable, you know, ring attire, also survive some interesting opponents. You think of, you know, being able to get through and put over guys like Kamala and Giant Gonzalez, and then another guy who was literally called the Undertaker and dressed like you, and still get out on the other end and look like a superhuman, you know, machine. You know, such a great character, and he persevered, you know, the test of time. There's a reason why, you know, that WrestleMania streak ran as long as it did, and then even after losing to Brock, still such a respected streak. And, you know, such a respected guy in the back, and seems like a pretty cool dude. You know, he just really does. If you listen to him talk, seems pretty down to earth, pretty cool, and a guy you'd like to go out and have a beer with.
Yeah, I mean, to Travis's point, I don't know if anyone has had to work with a consistently worse set of opponents for as long as the Undertaker did, and yet still managed to somehow be as popular as he was. I mean, you know, God, I feel like with rare exception, from 1990 until maybe 1996 or 7, I mean, the Undertaker it was just like, here's the latest piece of shit we hired. They have never put on wrestling boots before, but they can make a mean face at the camera. So we decided that you're going to spend the next 6 months wrestling them every night. Good luck to you, sir. Yeah, and he, you know, he managed to make it work. It's just there are so many terrible opponents that he had to put up with, and God bless him for figuring out a way to you know, turn chicken shit into chicken salad.
For sure.
I think that one of the things that, and this again might be personal bias, but if you look at it from a business perspective, it certainly makes sense. You know, one thing that, you know, you look back at his career, not that it matters at all, but he's a guy who was at the top of his game and at the top of the promotion without even being the champion for the majority of his career. I mean, he had the World Heavyweight Championship a handful of times, he had a WWE Championship a hand. You know, it takes a special kind of performer to be known as the top of your game and the top of your promotion without being a champion. I mean, most of The Rock's career, when he became The Rock, after they got rid of the awful Rocky Mavia, and, you know, after he becomes The Rock, leaving the Nation of Domination, you know, he was a champion, and in a lot of champion matches for most of his career. Stone Cold, the same way. A lot of these characters were champions, and that's what made them stand out. But The Undertaker was just one of those guys who came in every day, did what he was supposed to do against the litany, as you said, of both awful and terrific wrestlers, and did not hold a championship for as many times as he could have. For someone his size, there's no reason he couldn't have been the world heavyweight champion or the WWE champion for the majority of his career. But he didn't need that in order to be successful, which I think is kudos to him for being able to survive like that without having to be in the spotlight, but still being such a respected person in wrestling and in the history of wrestling.
Well, folks, it's getting about that time.
Yes, sir.
I gotta head out.
Well, that's a perfect place to end.
I want you to know I really appreciate you having me on. Always super fun for me to do these. So I'm always ecstatic to hear that you want me back.
And we will. I would have these conversations with the two of you till God comes back and takes us home. So until, for sure, we will be doing this again. I don't know what the topic is going to be, but I'm sure we will do this again. So Lowery, Travis, thank you so much for joining Afro Latinos podcast and for joining us on this occasion. Thank you so much for tuning in to this newest episode of Afro Latinos. Make sure to follow us on all of our social media. Like, follow, comment, share. Let us know how we're doing. We appreciate you. We thank you. This has been another episode of Afro Latinos with your host, Aubyn. Good night, Lowery. Good night, Travis. Good night, everybody.